Okay. So my name is Avi Dolgin, and now I'm a glorious 63 years old. But back when I came to Vancouver in 1971, I would have been 25, I guess. Um, I had as a summer job in 1965 or 66, worked with the Student Christian movement in Montreal, a collective mental health summer. And we worked, the whole bunch of us, at what's now called, I think, the Verdun Mental Hospital. At the time it was called the Douglas Mental Hospital, or vice versa. I forget which name came first, which came second. So I had spent a summer working at Douglas Mental Hospital, and I had been, just working, I think, on the youth wing, and that was a useful piece of skill. In 1970, early 70, Ruth and I traveled to Israel. We lived in Jerusalem for about a year and a half. And while job hunting there, I managed to go into a mental hospital there and say, oh, well, I've got experience. I worked in the Verdun Hospital, Doug's Hospital in Montreal. You should hire me here. And they did. The hospital is called Kfar Shaul. And I worked there for, I guess, about a year and a quarter or something. Ruth then joined later on from another job. And then from Jerusalem in 1971, we moved to Vancouver. So when I came to Vancouver, I had a couple of mental health jobs under my belt. I was not terribly happy on some level, having worked in big institutions. Mental hospitals were scary places. They were more designed to, well, you had to control people. You couldn't let them go running around on the street, for God's sakes. So you had to kind of keep them, safe and happy and medicated. And I chafed a little bit at the, power element of that. So when I heard of, and I don't even remember how I heard of, MPA as being a free association of the kind of people I had worked with, setting their own rules, that's what drew me in. Okay, that's my intro piece.
That was nice. I'm a little. Were your politics any more formed than this general feeling that the institution wasn't? Did you have more specific politics that were?
Well, I mean, post-60s, ex-hippie, liberal type guy, right? So I had the politics which were generally floating around in the late 60s, early 70s, and which I haven't, thank God, grown out of even today. Did I have an analysis? I have not read, for instance, Thomas Zaz. So I didn't have a particular analysis on where mental health sat in terms of the various oppressions in there, which, black oppression, women's oppression, all the oppressions that we talked about. We certainly added mental patient association, mental patient oppression, and voicelessness of those people. When I was working at MPA, and all of that resonated with me. Did I come to MPA with that kind of analysis? Not particularly. I just had a general distrust of institutions.
But through your association with MPA, you started to pull together those ideas. Was that a fair?
Yeah, I mean, you added that analysis to your understanding of the various groups who were not heard in our society, and history was written by successful white males, right? History is not written by the by the disabled, by the minorities, by the women, by the insane. Right? So the normative statement of what our culture is, it was a narrative of, look at me saying this, right? White male, elder white male. So I'm trying to remember, even this is probably at the time that Black Power was rising up, and there's various consciousness of various underrepresented groups having the right to speak in their own names, and it was not my idea. I think it was Landy's idea that I saw the wisdom of that. Here was a general grouping of people who were not heard to speak in their own names, so to have an organization which enabled them to do so made perfectly good sense in the the light of the fact that this was post-60s, early 70s type of ideology. I don't know that it shaped mine. I then started reading more things on mental health. When I had worked at the mental hospitals, you certainly gave a lot of thought as to, was I doing the right thing? And I could think of people that I worked with, institutionalized people I worked with. Was I really serving their interest in listening to their narrative or not listening to their narrative, in limiting their freedom of movement or not limiting their movement? We had groups of people like Russia in Israel that we kind of took out into town. We just kind of go for coffee, the Cafe Nava in downtown Jerusalem, just so people could go out and behave like anybody else could. And this was, generally viewed, I think, by the rest of the staff, the Israeli staff, as being kind of a little bit of American craziness that I think those folks were doing. Ruth and I took a group of patients with us on a march. It's an annual event in Israel. It's like a 3-day march, kind of run by the army. I don't know if it's still going on, but it was then. And you kind of go out and you hike for several days over mountains and hills between the villages, and then you settle in this little tent camp, and then you march the next day and come around back to the tent camp again. And it's a big kind of collective exercise in outdoor activity. Wow, a bunch of institutionalized people who've been walking back and forth between their ward, where they buy the cigarettes. This is, but when we suggested that, who was interested, and we got a number of patients who wanted to do it, and then we had to kind of get permission from the director of the hospital to go out for several hours a day and kind of just, hike around and get people into shape and get their stamina up. The issue there actually wasn't even so much the ideology of it, it's the fact that we were asking for extra hours. Right, oh my gosh, you take part of your work day to go just walk around, well, we have to get someone else to cover you, budgetary issues become the issues that dominate these things. But those are the kinds of innovations we tried to bring in to some degree. I don't think of it as that we were terribly brilliant in that matter. It's just like, this is what we would do with friends, this was where we worked, let's tie it all together. But there weren't a lot of other people trying to do that. Now that was within the institution. So, was that any type of forward thinking on the matter? I don't know. It was a little more liberal than standard closeted, you work for these hours and you medicate them for those hours, you feed them at those hours. I forgot what the question was.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. So, did you have any what was your educational background?
Oh, I had a general BA from University of Manitoba.
Okay. So no health.
Sciences, psychology, and religious studies.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So Ruth, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ruth Hess Dolgin, and in those days I was Ruth Hess. We weren't quite married yet. Came to Vancouver. Well, I'm from complicated history. My education and most of my growing up years were in New York. And then we came to Vancouver in 1971. I was 24 years old, after a couple of years, about a year and a half in Israel, in Jerusalem, and Avi talked about that, so I won't talk about that. My educational background is I have a BA in psychology from City College of New York, and that period of time between being in New York and coming here, and that time in Israel was the time I was trying to figure out, what do I do with my life? Like, what kind of education do I continue with? And I had been considering going into psychology, and somehow love got in my way, so that took a while, and then decided to go into social work. And the reason we came to Vancouver was because I was accepted at the UBC School of Social Work. So I also worked at Kfar Shaul Mental Hospital when we were in Israel. Before that, when I was doing my psychology degree, I also worked at the New York State Psychiatric Institute as an aide on a ward that was studying the effects of lithium on bipolar disorder. So going into the field of mental health is something that I thought of throughout my kind of young adult years. Coming here, I was at the school of social work, and while I was there, I did some volunteer work at MPA, and I got connected to MPA through Ave.
Right, okay.
And just kind of to add,
Yeah,
in more recent years, working at Ruth Child and Youth Mental Health in Vancouver, I had some recent contact with MPA up to about 3 years ago.
yeah, and it would be nice to come back to that
Sure.
later on in the interview. Okay, so you're not clear how you connected with MPA, but
I wonder if it's through Tom Sanborn, maybe. I mean, somehow, I mean, when you were kind of hanging out in Kitsilano in Vancouver in 1971, you knew about things that were going on in Kitsilano in 1971. So I don't remember who first suggested to me that I talked with MPA.
and MPA was one of those things that was going on in Kits in 1971.
It was getting going on. I think Lanny was just kind of getting underway at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah, because if you think 40 years.
Yeah, no, 71 was when they
71
started.
is when they started.
And so you arrive, like your personal history and MPA's history kind of just,
Yeah, we just both
dovetail.
kind of poof, we'll both find ourselves in Kitsilano, at the same golden moment.
yeah.
And it could have been Tom, because sometime in that year, we started living with Paul Kermsey, who was a teacher at the School of Social Work at that time, and Tom and Paul ran groups together. They did the Gestalt groups together
Yeah.
in those days, so
So
probably.
So it may have been through Tom.
And you knew Tom from Winnipeg.
No.
Oh.
Tom's not from Winnipeg.
Oh, no,
It would
Chrissy's
be
not. Sorry,
Tom.
somebody's from Winnipeg.
Oh, that's Sid Filko.
Sid's from Winnipeg.
Tom would have been connected to Paul Kermsey,
Right,
who was an instructor, and then we all lived in a communal
Yeah.
household together.
yeah. So Ruth, how did it,
Right.
I wanted to just ask you this question before it drops off my radar, but
Mhm.
how did your training you were getting at UBC kind of fit with the practice at MPA? Or like what was happening at MPA?
Well, there were a few of us at the School of Social Work, again, being children of the 60s, right, who were questioning some of the things we were learning at the School of Social Work. And there was a group of us who actually was an anti-psychiatry. Do you remember that newsletter magazine we got? It came out of Boston. And it was some newsletter. Mel McDonald and I were kind of the ones who sold it at school. So the whole questioning of traditional psychiatry was something that was happening to a few of us students at the school,
Yeah.
within the school. And then obviously I'm kind of echoing some of the things Avi said. This was also a time of exploration in a lot of ways, and a time of struggle with establishment in a lot of ways. I also at the same time became involved in the women's movement, and we had a group called the Women's Place. So there were overlaps with MPA and the Women's Place and some of the other groups that I affiliated with.
Was the women's place at UBC or in Kits?
It was in Kids,
Right.
and that was the precursor to the Women's Health Collective.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Because I did wonder if there was a connection between the Women's Health Collective, which I know a bit about, and the MPA. Do you want to
I don't know how many of us were kind of connected, but I think there was connection in spirit.
Yes.
That many of the same type of people became involved with
And-
Women's Place and with MPA, and there were, I think around the same time the Crisis Center was being established. So there was a lot of these kind of health
Right.
initiatives that were being developed at that time.
Yeah.
And it's the same type of people who would get involved in all of those. And some of us at the School of Social Work, there were only 60 students in my class, and we were a small group. And in those days, I think we were a vocal group.
Yeah. And was this all kind of Kits action then? Like it does seem to have a Kits. Like I was surprised the MPA seems to be more UBC connected than SFU connected. I just was surprised by that.
Oh, because of the politics.
But so far, the connections seem
It's
to be
geographical, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to think. Groovy people lived in Kits, right? with the exception of Tom and Phil Gray's house over there, way over on Quebec Street. Lanny lived in Kits, and we ultimately moved into Kits. So that was the zeitgeist of Vancouver in those years. SFU was up on the hill, but I don't know. SFU
And it
was,
didn't have social work, and it didn't have nursing.
Right.
it was also, I think, still under, to some degree, the blacklist. There was a time when early SFU had fired, I guess, 4 of its instructors. And so a kind of a counter blacklist was pronounced on SFU by the left. And I know a lot of people simply didn't have a lot to do with SFU at the time, kind of out of solidarity with the, I don't know if they're called the SFU 4 or whatever. Mordecai Brimberg was one of them. I think he, to this day, does not forgive them, but he doesn't forgive a lot of people. So yeah, it just never, SFU was just not part of our domain that way.
Yeah,
It had been
Yeah.
too radical, and then it just became kind of cut off.
Yeah.
And for me personally, I just come to Canada. I didn't know anything about SFU or any of these issues. So I was accepted to UBC, and there that's who I was connected with.
Yeah, because I think the very first piece of funding that Lanny got for the MPA was from the UBC graduating class of 69 or something like that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Mm.
So, and then Company of Young Canadians was another early
Right.
funding
Yeah.
source. So how about you guys talk about your impressions of the MPA? Did, the drop-in center, you were involved with the housing coordinator.
My official title was housing coordinator, that's right. I think that was because, I guess, a lot of these things, as always, have to do with funding. There was funding for a housing coordinator, so that was my designated job, and I was spending a lot of time kind of, reading the ads in the Vancouver Sun and Province and trying to go and convince landlords that they actually would want to turn over their house to a small collective of 4 or 5 people, and that they didn't need to worry because things, the organization stood behind the rent, and I had to do a fair amount of reassuring of landlords, lining up accommodation, and then trying to make sure that the people who live together create a kind of a bit of a harmonious community. Again, this was part of the idea that you had said before, that Lanny saw that it's such a big issue for mental patients, which is personal alienation. And so to work your way back in society, you kind of needed friends, and so living alone in single rooming houses after discharge from Riverview was not going to get you any better. But living with 2 or 3 other people and cooking together and watching TV together and all that kind of thing, this would give you people to talk to. This would give you people to act with. So one could form a kind of mental patient's political consciousness. But therapeutically, you just would live a more rich life if you were not living alone. And so as housing coordinator, that interface between the landlords and the building up of the communities was my defined job. And that was really a part of it. A large part of it was simply hanging out at the MPA house. If there's housing, it got handed over to me, but you just kind of spent time at the house, sitting around, playing cards, arguing with people, driving folks to their appointments, helping lay out the latest edition of In a Nutshell. I sometimes ended up being the person who chaired the meetings because the thing was hyper democratic. There was all decisions were made in public meetings.
So how about describing that?
Well, it was one of these situations where the lovely '60s ideals meeting the hard nuts and bolts of doing it sometimes ran aground. Hiring, for example, you applied for the job as being documenter for MPA or something, and so you'd sit down in front of a group of 15 or 20 people who come to the meeting to listen to you, to decide whether they like you or not. Now, of course, there's no guarantee the 15 or 20 people who are at this week's meeting were going to be the same 15 or 20 people who are going to be at the meeting 2 weeks from now, which ultimately was going to have to confirm it all, right? So you ran into that problematic issue. There was a core group of people who, of course, were committed to always coming. Lanny, very cool. There's Patty Servant, who you interviewed, was there steadily. And there are a number of people who were there on a pretty regular basis. And after a while, of course, the people who were there most regularly got viewed by other people as being the leadership. And so you have the paradoxical situation of saying, if people can come together, their own leadership will rise from among them. Women can lead women, and blacks will lead blacks, and Native people will lead Native people. We don't need outsiders. And then you get internally the resentment of the new leadership, right? Who does she think she is to tell us what to do? Where does he get off thinking he runs this organization? So you would have a democracy which was very self-reflective. Yes, we are democratic. We decide everything together. On the other hand, I wasn't at the last meeting. He was, so I trust him. And somebody else says, "Why are you trusting him? He's just telling us all what to do. He's just the new boss." And so you get these kind of divisive strands, strangely, in trying to run any group. And this is specifically that it's an application, but any group on hyper-democratic principles.
Do you remember the night you were elected to get the job? Because I have distinct memories of that evening.
Good, tell the story.
Yeah, go for it.
I forgot that.
I remember. There was you, and there was this. I remember you, and I remember this older woman who must have been in her 50s. And she had been a nurse, and people. There were a whole bunch of people. Fran, that's right.
Do you have Fran?
Oh, I'm sure she's gone by now.
Yeah.
I mean, she'd be.
Fran is the most wonderful person.
She'd be over. I don't know what now.
Wonderful person.
But there was a lot of distrust, first of all, of Fran, because she had come from the establishment. She was old, because most of MPA membership were young. So this most of MPA membership were, my impression was young, not with families. Very few had families or kids at that point, whether they were people like Avi or people who actually were mental patients. And I also remember that handing out cigarettes helped if you were going to become elected. You don't remember that?
I handed out cigarettes?
I think you might have handed out cigarettes.
I don't believe that.
I think you might have.
Handed out
I
cigarettes?
didn't accuse you. I said I remember handing out cigarettes helped
It's like
get
an
votes.
old-time electioneering drug pusher routine.
So there was a bit of that.
I deny it. Let's take that one off the tape.
Guys can debate on this one.
But it was a very. But I remember at least discuss. There was discussion of that. People didn't know how rationally they were being voted upon. And getting the jobs or not. And I remember both you and Fran were not sure you were going to get them.
No.
You were quite nervous about it.
Well, I was an outsider. I mean,
and she was an outsider.
And she was an outsider. And
for different reasons.
She, in fact, looked extremely establishment. She was a nurse, and she was eminently reasonable and sensible. She's probably one of the best people NPA ever had, just in terms of she's completely open-hearted and completely committed to people's empowerment. But she also knew what was reasonable, what was not, and she gave solid advice. And
she knew how the establishment worked. So, as somebody who kind of observed, I mean, I was both an intern, I was insider in some ways, through Avi, and I was going to volunteer. I don't think I did yet at this point, but I was also a member of the establishment by being a student at the School of Social Work. So I saw this, this dynamic happening in front of my eyes, and also saw that it wasn't always rational dynamic.
You also have the issue, of course, that because there's a mental patient association, it's a very good question to ask. Should we hire anybody who's not a mental patient? You know, I mean, Avi comes there because he worked at Verdun Hospital and kind of chafed under that organization. He worked at, in Jerusalem and kind of chafed under that organization. So he comes as somebody who understands the problems and he's opposed to the institutionalization. Well, I mean, that's probably the line that I used. But the fact is, I had not been institutionalized. And, so on one level, I think what Lanny was hoping would happen, and I'm sure Lanny will said this better than I do. My sense of it is that if you empower people, then they will rise up from the ranks, and that ideally MPA should have been entirely run and staffed by people who had breakdowns or in and out of psychosis or whatever it was. But in fact, for any number of reasons, we can conjecture what they all were, there weren't sufficient numbers of such people. And so they had to go to the outside. They had to go to, supportive allies. In fact, I think your list put me on as, you've got categories there, I think. Ex-patient and ally, that's right. And the whole question of to what degree should we be using allies was a continual thread, and every time that, it would come up again that there would be a vote. Someone would be on for, 6 months. This was like job security in those days, 6 months.
And reliance on grants.
And that's all reliance on grants. I mean, and then 6 months later, so the person would, want to continue, but somebody else who had been a mental patient, now wanted the job. And on one level, you want to say, well, good, so good that Charlie feels together enough to do it. Let's put Charlie in instead of Lorraine. But then, but Lorraine's been doing the job pretty well for 6 months, and Charlie is still a bit of a flake, right? And I may be wrong in thinking this, but I think there tended to be also on the floor of the meetings a greater trust or reliability among the ex-patients in the non-patients. I think to some degree they look to the non-patients as being, well, you guys have had your shit together all these years. You're probably going to deliver a good job over the next 6 months. Toby's a nice guy, but I'm not sure I would necessarily trust him. Although it was again the contrary feeling. Maybe Toby is not as reliable, but what are we here for if not to give Toby a chance? Let's take the money, give it to Toby, and and if Toby crashes and burns, but this might be his flowering. So you had that tension in the democratic process.
And I think it's an issue of democratic process, but I see it now in the empowerment of First Nations people in organizing their own organizations. I know that VACFAS, which is the Vancouver Aboriginal Child and Family Service, has a lot of non-native staff because they can't yet get enough native staff. But they're moving that.
Yeah, and the difference between First Nations and psychiatric survivor consumers is that in the Aboriginal community, it's moving that way.
That's right.
In the field of mental health, it's still a real rarity.
It was a blip in the past.
Well, there's Gallery Gachet in Vancouver. Yes. There's Sound Times in Toronto, which those are survivor consumer run organizations. But so it's hard to
it's hard.
It's hard.
And also it's a different being a First Nations person is not a disability in the same way that having a psychiatric disorder might be, if it's not controlled. But I was also going to say, in addition to Gallery Gachet, here I am the representative of the establishment now too, kind of a little bit of both. There is consumer advocacy in mental health in Vancouver.
Yes. Yes.
And Greater Vancouver Mental Health, when it existed, I think was influenced by some of the same things that that MPA was, or was influenced by MP. You know, who knows? The
Yeah.
same influences out there. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore, but there's still some remnants.
Yeah.
There's at least one job I know that is a consumer position.
Yeah. Yeah.
There may be some others, and they created Gallery Cachet.
Right. Okay. Okay. Which is 20 years old, I think.
And
year.
GVMH
It's-
still
it's,
existed in those days.
You know, it's that's a success story, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that the OT department, the rehab department, is involved in mental health now, I think is congruent. They learned from the same sources that I think MPA learned from, or other parents learned from MPA.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So some of it is still there.
Yeah.
Not enough.
I wanna pick up on one of the threads that you mentioned when you were painting a picture of the homes and the opportunities for living collectively and the
Mhm.
meaning of living collectively. And so I guess I just want to pose the question, like, how successful was that?
Mixed. Some of them worked. I mean, none of them became long-term in the sense that people, I think, stayed together for years and years and years. Some of them worked better than others. As I go back on this, you know, I'm a lousy one for names, but I'm remembering some faces, I'm remembering some people who were involved. Part of it was some of the success in some of the houses depended on people with bipolar disorder and where they were in their phase, which I don't think I fully appreciated at the time. You know, is they take, you know, mild-mannered Megan here and put her, you know, as part of a home. You know, she looked for a place to live, and you know, you look for a place to, and we put people together, and slowly but surely, you kind of feel a little better, and you know, you'll do the shopping this week at Safeway, and it's great, you'll do the shopping, and you know, do this, do that, you know, come to the meetings, and you'll speak up and give your opinion, and everyone's going, right, okay, she's kind of feeling at home, she's feeling more herself, and then you start speaking, we can't shut you up, and you start telling people like what you're going to buy at Safeway, and they can't, everyone's going to eat what you're, you know, what you're making, and slowly but surely you become the kind of the dictator of the household, because you're just going really, really hyper and 100 miles an hour. And I watched a number of my houses do that in some sense. They became the territories of people on the manic phase of a bipolar disorder, and they hadn't been there when the houses, they hadn't been in that phase when the houses were set up. And then other people, in some sense, were hostage to them. You know, like, I live with this guy, and he's just, you know, he talks a mile a minute, and you know, and he's telling me what I should wear, and you know, we have to go places when he's ready to go, and all that kind of thing. So I'm thinking of two different houses in which that happened, and I, you know, hadn't seen it, foreseen it happening. There were others in which, you know, things worked out quite nicely. You know, the smaller houses with low turnover, and people kind of stayed together as a supportive grouping. Now, in my total time in MPA was, I don't know. So you probably put the data down there somewhere.
Well, yes, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know how long you were involved in it.
You know, I mean, you know, I was involved longer than I was paid, of course, you know, because, you know, the money came and went, but still kind of stayed involved. But ultimately in 1973, Ruth and I got married and went traveling for a year in South America. So, I mean, that was a break with anything I should have gone before. When I came back, not to, you know, give up on the whole idea of collective voice and process, I came back and got all involved with co-op radio, neighborhood radio, you know, and all that kind of thing. So, you know, still in that kind of that zone with the same value system for years. The housing was, I think, mixed success. I think it did serve some people well for a while, and some of the houses were rather artificially put together socially, in the hopes that people would gel, and they don't. When Ruth and I first moved to Vancouver in July of '71, we opened up the Vancouver Sun and looked to find a collective living situation. We found some people with a house on Welwyn Avenue, and we moved in there, and every one of them was a nice person. But it didn't work. I mean, people had different ideas of, we're of the view, well, we pool our money and stock the fridge. And these people are of the view, well, this is my shelf on the fridge, this is your shelf on the fridge, this is your shelf on the fridge. We're doing laundry, who needs laundry done? Hey, who stuffs in the machine? I'm doing laundry now. So none of those are wrong ways to be, but just for us, that didn't work out until we did manage to kind of build a kind of a co-op house later on. This was the era, of course, of co-op house, especially with Dr. Kitsilano. But as housing coordinator, I was largely dealing a hand and saying, okay, 7 of clubs, 4 of diamonds, queen of spades, king of diamonds, and the joker. You guys are a house, and it's pretty hard to win with that kind of dealt hand.
So you were actually setting up the original houses then? I
was setting up the houses and kind of, as people were joining MPA, finding their way in, and I would meet with them and talk to them and say, I can meet so-and-so. I think, so-and-so's looking for housing. What do you think? Or, you've got a spot coming up over there. It's, 2 men and 1 woman. I guess we probably need another woman in there so the woman there doesn't feel uncomfortable. Well, there are these 2 women who've recently kind of joined in who are looking for housing. I'll go over with these 2 women and they can sit around and meet those folks and see what works. I mean,
And these are rentals.
The housing's all rentals.
All
yeah.
rentals. So,
but was soon enough MPA started buying houses, but you weren't involved with that.
That was later.
That was later, because I know that the first ones were rented.
Yeah.
And then they got Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation funding and were able to buy very successful property management within the organization.
Yeah, no.
But that came later.
But that's later.
After my time.
Yeah.
I'm still in the kind of hippies renting a house together phase.
Yeah.
And everything was rented. The drop-ins were rented. All the anything that they had was rented.
And so did you spend time it sounds like you spent time at the drop-in as well.
On Trutch.
On Trutch, yes.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time at Trutch. I spent more time on Trutch at the drop-in. That was really, because from Trutch is where you did your organizing. From Trutch is where you got to meet people who dropped in. And I really go over to people's houses. Maybe I'd say, hey, can I join you guys for dinner on Tuesday or something like that? How's it going? I didn't go and run their houses because it was the model was that I was empowering them, helping them to set up and then run on their own.
And my sense is that as things evolved, each house developed its own character, which is what you're...
As you would hope,
Yeah, yeah.
And, and in some of the houses you had some people who were political is the word, but more activist, and saw their house as being, in some sense, a blow for mental patients at times. And some houses it was simply, oh good, I've got a roof over my head, that's all I want.
And did you get a sense within the MPA that it was that it was okay to be both, that both those perspectives were okay?
Yes, it had to be that way because it was started with a political view. It was clear what Landy was hoping for, in some sense. But many people dropped in and joined in did not particularly share that activism, even though the writing in a nutshell, or the quotings of the works of Thomas Zaz and all that, were in some sense meant to help bring group consciousness to people who came without consciousness, as we talked about bringing women's consciousness, or black consciousness, or native consciousness, or all these, all the groups in that time had their ideologues, and we had their members, right? And we were no different in that respect, right? And you ultimately the women's movement, or the black movement, or the Jewish movement, or the left-handed curlers movement would have to say, well, yes, I'm in here because left-handed curlers aren't getting enough recognition in the world of right-handed curlers, and somebody else would be saying, I just want to curl, I don't need to march, I want to curl. And every organization had that. I mean, that's just the range of human behaviors.
I think here you also had, people who needed that social connections, just like you said. The political, you have to have all your other needs met before you can become political. So some people came because there was some food around, there were people around.
It's always important that there be food around. There's always to be a comfortable place to drop in. Fundamentally, it needs to be a comfortable place to drop in.
And that's okay.
And that's what the drop-in was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
it was critical that you weren't coming to an organizing meeting. This was not, you didn't walk in and get addressed as comrade, get handed a placard. You got handed a banana or a cigarette.
Or a cigarette. In those days, it was
or a cup of coffee.
or a cup of coffee,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
is soon to
And
be like a cigarette.
so you're saying that a lot of the people that came to the drop-in were young.
Yeah, we were young,
Yeah.
and we didn't think of ourselves as young, but Fran, who was somewhere around 50s, was considered old.
Right.
We didn't see that many old people.
There were some folks. There's a fellow named Tom who was in his upper 30s, 40, and he was, I viewed as being among the elders of the crowd.
And Molly Dex.
Melly Dixell, yeah.
I think she was
She was
older.
she was older.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So
Bit of
she
a
was one
range.
few.
And Jackie Hooper, though nobody else has mentioned this, but she talked about Aboriginal people coming from the Native Friendship Center and hanging out at the drop-in. Did that resonate for you guys? I was totally intrigued by that
I don't remember.
possibility.
If they did, they dropped in as individuals, and I wasn't aware particularly of a.
No, it wasn't an organizational
Yeah,
thing. It was
a
just that
conti-
it
or
was a
even a
place that they
contingent,
felt comfortable.
Yeah.
I was intrigued that, because of course I was trying to find these people, and the women are the hardest to find. And I contacted a woman who had poetry published in a nutshell, and she said that she just read SAS she was a creative writing major at UBC, and she just came to the drop-in a few times, had some poetry published in a nutshell. I was intrigued that that's a creative writing student, university student, would come to a drop-in for ex-patients, mental health patients.
But I think in those days, I think it's part of that period of time that we were all just discovering, and that was part of discovery. And you read SAS, and you read books like that, and you were struggling. Most of the people I know were in some sort of therapy, though they weren't psychiatric patients necessarily. But it was an age of exploration. And that was part of it.
And the drop-in center was a happening place. It was like one of the spots that gets allowed to go for a good discussion and a cup of coffee, and it wasn't just some kind of dead-end outpatient's day room. This was.
Oh, why is that for?
Brilliantly. You guys were doing wonderfully about the way in which the drop-in was inclusive. Because Willie's dad is the director of PARC, which is the Parkdale
Activity Recreation Center.
And there's staff there that's kind of York students
Yeah.
with modern haircuts and
Right,
stuff like that.
exactly. Yeah.
But and political blah blah blah. But they're not. I don't know. I just like the image that people paint of the drop-in center is different. I was so struck by that UBC creative writing student, just going there to hang out, you know? I think, so I think what you're saying is just so evocative of that moment and the possibilities of that historical moment, and like you said, that personal growth piece, right?
Yeah.
You guys haven't mentioned Artie Lang.
Yeah, I was just gonna say after, like that, we're all reading R.D. Lang, I mean, the Zaz, R.D.
Yeah.
Lang, all that stuff, yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
In Zaz, I think it was more political. R.D. Lang had a kind of an alternate view of what madness was, and I think and Zaz had more of a take on what the institutions were doing to people.
yeah.
Now I have mixed feelings about both of them now.
And Goffman, maybe you were reading
Yeah, I remember
Goffman's
Goffman too,
Asylums.
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, you
yes.
probably particularly with your social work.
And the film, what's his name's films?
Ken Loach's
Um,
film, Wednesday's Child. No, it's
No, I'm thinking of the one about the hospital for the criminally insane in
Chitticut Follies?
Chitticut Follies, and I just can't. He's done some amazing stuff. Chitticut Follies is the whole. I can't think of his name right now.
Yeah. Other cultural context for this? Poets. I'm just wondering, since we're on this topic.
Well, not so much in terms of, the anti-psychiatry movement and poetry, but, I worked in the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and some of the folks who were patients there, I mean, I didn't necessarily get to meet them, especially the outpatients, but some of them were well-known poets, well-known theater people. I became very aware of the relationship between manic depressive psychosis, as we called it in those days, and creativity.
Seems
that
to me
became-
there was a lot of creativity, like looking at, in a nutshell, and the place that poetry and art had in a nutshell, consistently. It strikes me that there was a real space for artistic expression with the NPA.
Yeah, that was to
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
encouraged. It really was. That was important. Well, no, I mean, just, at the time, nothing more to say that. It really was encouraged. I mean, if people are going to speak up, they're going to discover who they are. They're going to discover that who they are is not simply some, damaged person who needs to be suppressed by drugs, but, and they express themselves through, sketch work and poetry and all that. So, of course you would want to give people as much opportunity as possible, both to speak and be heard. It's one thing to publish poems, it's another thing to publish poems that people actually then read, give you feedback on it, and say, oh, I know how you feel about that. So it's very important to have that.
Yeah, and did you have like writing and art workshops at the drop-in?
Yeah, I think so. There's a lot going on there. I mean, I think Ruth would sometimes wonder why I came home so late. Says, well, it's like there's stuff going on. There was this was happening and that was happening. So though I can't specifically put my finger on it, it would I would think that probably people kind of sat down a Tuesday afternoon and did poems together in a corner or something.
Yeah, and it's interesting that the way you described your job was very fluid. That you didn't just do the find housing.
Right. No,
set
if
people.
there's housing to be done, it was given to me, right? So that we knew who was on top of it. But really, that was only that was the rationale for my getting a salary, so that I could kind of hang out the house a lot.
Yeah. And in a nutshell, where was it printed? Do you have any idea? You laid it out at the drop-in center?
Did Lanny actually have like a mimeograph machine in his house or
I
something?
think he might have. I mean, certainly that his house became a press much later.
Yeah, the press gang.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I
New
was
Star.
New Star Publishing.
New Star. Yeah, it wasn't press gang.
With Sam Persky.
Yeah.
Right. So press gang was the
Was
famous
women's.
famous collective. Yeah. So I would. Got to go back to Lenny on this one, but I think, simply the physical printing of in a nutshell probably was through Lanny, quite possibly, at his house.
Yeah, okay, okay. The earliest ones, I think, are, oh no, maybe you're, well, the earliest ones are, I think, just mimeograph sheets, and then it evolves into a newspaper format fairly quickly. Some of the other publications were published by the Georgia Strait. Some of the other MPA things were typeset by the Georgia Strait. I think Lanny had, and Barry and Stan had connections with the Georgia Strait. And again, it's part of that whole
That whole,
circle that you guys found yourselves in when you came to Vancouver in
because the
1971.
Georgia Strait was something different than what it is now.
Yes, yes.
Very different.
So you've referenced funding, and funding is really important with the MPA. Were those LIP grants that you were? Do you know if they were LIP grants?
Yeah, I would imagine there was with LIP and OFY. I can't remember which came first, which came later.
No, this would be lit because FY was, opportunities for youth. We were young, but we were already a little older than.
LIP came later, local initiative projects. Yeah, and it's and if we were getting money through Alberta, she was the
CYC. She wasn't lit.
she wasn't LIP.
No, she was CYC.
Company of Young
Canadian.
Canadians was an early funder.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have anything to do with getting the funding?
I didn't write the funding proposals. That's
And anyways, it sounds like you interpreted the funding kind of like loosely, so the funding just became bodies to help out.
basically, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you had to ensure that the things you said you're gonna do got done, but there are all these things that you figured they weren't going to fund that you wanted to make sure got done also, so you just kind of didn't mention that the people who were being paid to do X were also doing Y, or stuff like that.
Yeah, yeah. It certainly was one of the pieces behind the MPA's success in that period was just that funding was
There was money,
flexible.
those
There
were the
was money.
70s, what, you know,
Yeah.
it's hard to believe, yeah.
Yeah, and those LIP grants were amazing for funding. Okay, we talked a bit about process, about the houses. So one thing that both of you were involved with was therapy. And I wondered if you guys wanted to talk a bit about that, about, well, just about, it says here that you together ran this growth group in
Yes.
72.
And I don't remember doing any group with. I do remember doing a group with Tom
Okay.
Sanborn.
Okay,
Um,
do you want to talk about that? Do you remember
You
what
know,
year that
I don't
was?
remember a whole lot. What I do, I was studying to be a group worker, and it was basically an opportunity to bring people together to talk about what we didn't have any particular agenda, if I remember, except to talk about our feelings and what was going on with us. It wasn't any particular type of model that I was working on. Tom had a Gestalt kind of bent, and I was secondary. I followed his lead. So he ran the groups, I co-led the group.
And it was at the drop-in?
At the drop-in, yeah.
Right.
That's what I remember, but I don't remember much else. And you don't remember it all.
I don't remember at all.
Well, maybe it was a lie. Maybe.
Yeah, could be.
I mean, historical sources are not always
Yeah.
100% accurate. Right?
Or,
Maybe there was supposed to have been a group, but I don't remember running a group with you.
or maybe it was,
We may have been doing it both
it's
with
unlikely that we did it together, yeah.
We may have both been doing it with Tom.
Or we might have, had a couple of, get-together meetings in which both you and I kind of facilitated.
Could be.
And now the thing comes, gets a little, it's called, we ran a group, and, it has a little more majesty than it merited.
That could be. That we, just invited people to come and talk and be involved in the group again.
And that we just kind of between us coordinated, I don't know, I suppose.
I mean,
How important was the therapeutic? I mean, in essence, MPA was maybe not always anti-psychiatry, but critical. So how did therapy fit into the ethos of MPA. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, I know what you mean, and I wish I could give you a good answer on that one. Uncomfortably, I think is the.
But I think, defining MPA as therapy. I mean, I think that in terms of my thinking in those days, the process of what people were going through at MPA was therapeutic. So it was a different way of looking at what is therapy. It's I think it's the type of thing that, similar to what occupational therapists talk about, therapy, defining as therapy. Therapy is rehabilitation, living properly is therapy, and I think that that's what MPA tried to do, is to create a living therapy.
Although ultimately there are limitations inherent to that. I mean, the fact is, if you are suffering from schizophrenia, the fact that you get to vote at meetings and sit around and play chess with friends and live with somebody else, you're still got schizophrenia, and.
But people were still going to their psychiatrists. They were still getting their not every, people. Yeah. I don't remember MPA saying don't take your meds.
Right.
They said. I remember saying don't just rely on your meds.
Yeah. There's never any kind of meds are not permitted in the house type of thing. And in fact, Fran would always be saying like, well, it's important to do this and to do that. Let's go tobogganing and let's go over march and let's do that. But have you taken your pill today?
So
yeah. So there are limitations to what you can do on the social level. It is the therapy is to be part of a group. To live in the group house, to hang out at a drop-in center, which is an exciting place to be, to write poetry. All of that process is an integrating therapeutic process. But it can only go so far for some people. It may have been fine for some other people, but for some people there was an organic problem, and it still has to be addressed.
And if therapy is defined as insight, then people who were at that level probably didn't need a volunteer group at MPA. They were getting that elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they.
What do you mean by that?
Looking at therapy in the sense of looking at yourself and going through a real kind. I don't mean insight in the sense of should you take your meds or shouldn't take your meds but real deep psychology, really looking at inner self.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't doing that at those groups at MPA. Not heavy duty, real.
Well, not the kind of thing that one might do in psychiatry.
In a professional therapist office,
right.
Not necessarily a psychiatrist. But we weren't trying to re-establish or imitate what was going on elsewhere. And there were folks who were getting that elsewhere.
But we were also trying to do it though, in a social context. Look at yourself in terms of, was your father really an asshole? Did he beat you?
We didn't talk about that in the groups though.
Well, I think that kind of thing got bounced around in over coffee at the house, okay. Right? It's like, no, you're not worthless. Your father was an asshole, and you're carrying an anger at him, and all men are assholes or something like that. It depends how the helpful person helped you understand your past. But I think there was insight and awareness in the social context. People were helping each other view where they came from or where they could be going. Even sometimes they were simply laying their own analysis on it, mm-hmm. Right? Well, your problem really is, that's not a problem. I'm telling you that. It's your problem. That was my problem.
But that was informal. I'm talking about formal therapy.
Formal therapy
was not
on the agenda.
And it wasn't formal therapy in those groups. Those were support groups as opposed to insight therapy groups. Mm-hmm. That's what I'm trying to say. And yet it was therapeutic.
And neither of you were involved in the Vancouver Emotional Emergency Center, which ran, I think, 74, 75, which Tom was involved with.
I was a volunteer for the crisis center.
I think that's a different,
Okay.
this was Tom, there was a group of them that had funding for 1 year and set up a house that was a crisis. I think that's when you guys were traveling.
We were traveling in 73, 74,
Oh.
and then came back in 74, but no, we weren't involved.
Yeah.
At that point, we were trying to, we were at a different, you started working with Co-op Radio, I started working for the Children's Aid Society, Vancouver Resources Board, that was what it was called. So
Yeah.
we were establishing ourselves in different ways.
And then,
at that
did
point.
you work for the crisis?
I was on the phone lines with the crisis center for,
But that was at the same time as MPA, because you got kicked
Yeah.
out because you were part of MPA.
what's the name? Betty Tyrant come up anywhere? Betty Tarrant, sorry, has your name come up in any of these things?
No, but I think what has come up is that a LIP grant started the crisis center too. But I don't.
Yes,
But, yeah.
and there was a conflict, like, she didn't want people who were also working in MPA.
Okay, so this is really interesting.
It really
But
is, you know.
Sorry, but the tape is done. So.
Okay, so we're talking about.
And I was just before we talk about that, even in those days, the establishment organization, because I'm thinking of Greater Vancouver Mental Health, whatever it was called in the early days, the Community Mental Health Center was established at a parallel time, approximately,
Yes.
from as NPA.
Yeah.
So even establishment organizations were closer to the non-establishment ones
Well,
in
and
those days.
Hugh the interview with Hugh
Yeah.
Parfit, he went through this whole history of this community consultation that
Yes.
took place that was ultimately, in his mind, undercut by the response of the provincial government, which basically ignored the community input in the end, but it was a very different model of putting together policy and
Yeah.
practice than Riverview had ever pursued. But you were also, so you were involved with MPA and the crisis line at the same time.
Yeah, I was a volunteer on the crisis center. Did phone shifts, you know, when people call up, you know, help them through, get them to resources, and you know, listen, help them stabilize, or you know, quickly another call, get an ambulance or whatever it was. I mean, it was an emotional crisis, you know. So I mean, today people tend to go to 911 for a lot of things, and spend a lot of time with people in crisis. You know, primary job was to listen, not really to respond. And the crisis center had, I think, much more kind of establishment funding too. I think you know, people recognize the need, and so I don't know. You know, the United Way probably, you know, helped to fund the crisis center. And we operate out of a little room up in the, I think, neighborhood house, Alexandra neighborhood house. But, and Ruth reminds me, I've forgotten this, in the end, I kind of ran afoul of the woman who ran the crisis center, a woman named Betty Tarrant. And she refused to renew me. And ultimately it was, and it was pretty explicit, it was because I was involved with NPA. I don't think she could point to, you know, last Tuesday when you were on the phone, we have a recording that you were giving bad advice to so-and-so, so-and-so, or that you failed to show up for shifts. I don't think she ever kind of said, you know, you've demonstrated incompetence. She says, you know, your philosophy's wrong, your NPA, and, you know, just doing things differently, and, you know, ultimately, you know, I mean, it's quite personal. You know, Betty did not want to deal with NPA type people.
So so that's fascinating to me. So is the crisis line, I can't remember where Alexander House is, it Kits?
Well, it's since been torn down, but yeah,
Yeah,
it
it was a
Kits.
Kits,
Yeah.
So it was another Kits thing.
But it served the whole kind of Lower
Yeah,
Mainland.
yeah,
I mean,
but
that
it's
was,
interesting that it was physically located in
Yeah.
Kits too.
Here we go again,
But-
that's right.
But yeah, there we go. But, so in Betty's mind, what was an MPA philosophy?
You know, I don't even think I could fairly answer that without A, vilifying her, and B, just making the most wild guesses. You know, I mean, even as it is, saying that she did not want me on because I was NPA is reading a lot into a woman who should be allowed to, you know, speak and defend herself, the witch.
We don't want that on the
We might take that one off the tape. But you know, I mean, but clearly MPA was not universally loved within the community. Okay, I mean we can see that much. And here was somebody also in the, you know, helping world, dealing with people in emotional crises, who really was putting distance between herself and MPA. I mean, you really, as far as she was concerned, you know, Jesus said you can't serve two masters or something like that. And you know, she was the master over there, and she didn't want people who were, you know, worshipped to the church.
I mean, the crisis line, my personal reflection on that would be that the crisis line had this very explicit philosophy of how you responded in a certain, not disengaged,
We went through training, and we're, you know, clearly told this is, you know, this is how you will handle yourself on the phones, and that's right. And again, the primary job was to listen, and then try to steer people towards what can you do next. What can you do next? Are you okay? How can we get you through this crisis? You know, what are you going to do about this tomorrow? Who are you going to call? All that kind of thing. And we were, you know, so I mean, we got very clear instructions on, you know, how to basically be there as listeners, and to, you know, just realize that ultimately the person at the other end of the phone is running their own life, and you just want to make sure that they're kind of, you know, running well, and get the phone number and all that. So, you know, could we call you back tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, see if you're okay? And so we were clearly, you know, MPA did not have an operating manual policy, right? Crisis Center did, but all of us who worked there followed it. I think we did. I did.
Yeah.
And it wasn't incompatible. I mean, that was the funny thing. In my mind, there's nothing incompatible about being on the Crisis Center and being MPA. But it wasn't Betty's mind.
I think part of it was that the Crisis Center saw itself as working within the establishment, and MPA saw itself to the side. You know.
Okay.
Or Betty saw it as further off the side than we really were.
Yeah, but to even further to the side. Yeah.
Yeah. So, Fran's name has come up a lot in interviews, and she obviously was a really important person within the organization as it moved, I think, from the initial ideas of Lanny and other really early people.
Mm-hmm.
But since she's no longer here, I wondered if you wanted to talk a little bit more about Fran and what she brought to the MPA.
As somebody who wasn't very involved, I kind of think of her as Mama Fran. You know, a bit of that solid.
I think some folks around there referred to her as Mama
Oh,
Fran.
okay, that's how I think of her.
I think people called her like Mama Fran. I mean, she was well, I think, like we said first, she looked absolutely straight and respectable. Older woman, you know, nurse, all this kind of thing. Just the, you know, the image of what MPA wasn't. Right? But on the other hand, nothing shocked her. I mean, you know, she did not lecture anybody on drugs or sexual issues or any of that. I mean, she was, you know, so she did not represent in her values or her statements an establishment. And just her physical appearance, she looked like a totally straight older woman.
But she was also a solid woman.
And
I was thinking she
she
was
was
kind of a mother you'd want.
she was knowledgeable. I mean, for one thing, she knew, and she'd been in the field for years. I mean, she just gave you, you know, good response and advice. You know, I think I should do this. I don't think you should. I'll tell you why I think you shouldn't. You know, it's like, she was the mother we all wanted. Right? Absolutely.
Was she a psychiatric nurse? Had she been at Riverview?
If I remember correctly, she was community health nurse. I just have this memory of her as a community health nurse.
Maybe
Try to remember more than
maybe public health.
Yeah, that's what we now call
UBC.
community health.
Yeah. Maybe.
And for some reason, I have her in the North Shore. I don't know if she was living on the North Shore or working on the North Shore, but I have her on the North Shore.
Which she could have
My
been
memory.
with.
Could have been with both. Well, in those days, or at least in Vancouver, it was the Vancouver Health Department, so North Shore probably had the North Shore Health Department.
They had a very early health. I only know
Yeah.
the 1930s, but there you go. In the 1930s, the North Shore had a very well-established public health department, and UBC had the first public health nursing program in the Commonwealth. So there you go. That might
Wow.
be where she knew that. Yeah.
And if I remember this, if I got this clearly, I mean, this is a woman who was clearly employable in any type of, organization like that, and who chose not to work for them. Because, I began by saying I came out of a number of institutions feeling very anti-institutional. Fran chose to work in MPA because she found that to be the most exciting and valuable place that she could be.
Yeah.
It matched her values, and despite a whole bunch of people's distrust of this, this middle-aged nurse in our presence, everyone just had to recognize that, this lady had her shit together. She gave good advice. She put in lots of time. She was full of love, full of wisdom. It's funny, people I remember. Not that I remember, no. But it is somebody whom I have absolutely not a negative impression at all. It's not true of many people I've met in my life. I have nothing but good thoughts of how good Fran was and the time she put in for people. Get on the phone, she'd call Fran at home. Patty must have talked about Fran, I would think. Maybe not.
I can't remember.
But you could phone Fran at home and she would just sit on the phone with you for hours. She just was totally open to being there for people.
And that's an interesting, that for me is really fascinating, phone at home, because she was a professional.
Yeah, you
And
don't
that's
give out
that-
your number or professional.
That's
Yeah.
like,
That's the kind of barrier that she helped to smash.
She actually, I just had this vision of, we came when we were young, you particularly, when started work at MPA, as somebody who didn't want to work in an institution, ended up his life working in an institution. So did I. And she came in the other direction.
yeah.
That's interesting in and of itself.
Because that possibility was opening up, because Riverview was downsizing and they were creating these community health centers. So her professional life was able to move in that direction. Are there any other snapshots that you can offer of other people that were involved in MPA that were key?
You were friendly enough with Molly that I invited her to our wedding.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Molly Drexel. Well, she's probably the oldest person hanging around. Molly's just a nice,
She was a former patient, wasn't
Yeah.
she?
Yeah.
Yeah, an older woman.
older woman.
And she died, I think, at the end of the 70s.
Yeah, quite a while ago.
It's in a nutshell. But it's quite.
His son's around.
Oh yeah.
Fred.
Fred Dex. Yeah, people said that. I wonder, is he in Vancouver?
Last I knew he was in Vancouver. Blind. I've seen him
That's
around
what people
with,
always say. Yeah, yeah.
with his dog. He was, I don't want this on, I shouldn't mention it. Because I know, I've seen him around, but I don't, I can't say where I've seen him.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Still in Vancouver.
Often Molly was there by her on her own, just at the drop-in center. So Molly was there
With him.
with Fred.
Yeah.
Oh, he was a kid then, right?
Yeah.
Because what would he be now? 'Cause maybe even around almost late 40s, 50s.
Oh, yeah.
Actually,
Actually,
he's not that young.
yeah. No, he would be close to my age then.
Yeah.
Yes, if he was a kid then.
Yeah.
But there weren't a lot of kids there.
No.
But there were some kids.
Some people came with kids, like I said, just kind of, played on the carpet while other things were going on. Yeah. It wasn't particularly well set up for kids. I think that was one of the issues in as housing coordinator. Try to maybe put together parents with kids and get a house in which maybe you can have a room which would be a good place for kids to run around and play. You try to factor that in kind of designing futures for people. But like you said, most of the people did not have kids. Yeah, I guess, you know, a lot of people were, for reasons of their own illnesses or whatever, social isolates in the first place. So it did not tend to, you know, have formed.
And again, I don't know if this is my imagination or if I remember correctly. I remember more men than women, and I don't know if that's reality.
I don't know.
I just
Most people have said that.
oh
Yeah.
really okay.
Yeah,
I
people have said
remember
that.
more men.
People said that, but not, and it's the same at Park,
Yeah.
I think, but not entirely, yeah.
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 Okay.
I mean, it's, as I understand the theory is that women tend to remain more in family
Yeah.
groups and men tend to become more socially isolated, so a place like the drop-in center
Yeah.
would, yeah, it makes, that
makes
piece
sense.
makes sense.
Yeah.
It also makes sense that it was young because Kits was such a youthful area at that
Mhm.
point, for sure.
It also makes sense in terms of youth, well, schizophrenia, for example. Women are older when, usually, right?
Yeah.
When they become ill, so that may have some factor too, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. So you talk a lot about Lanny. So you see him as pretty key in the years that you were involved with?
This whole thing was his baby. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, it was Lanny's vision to create an organization whereby people who had been institutionalized could de-institutionalize and could organize on their own behalf. So yeah, you know, I think Lanny was the originator and the ideologue of the whole thing. You know, there's to some degree tension, polarity of perspective between someone like Lanny and then the people who were more, say, service oriented rather than politically oriented. Right? People were trying to, Lanny, I think, was trying to organize for change. In mental illness was seen. You know, people were trying to just make sure that the fridge was stocked. You know?
Is Fran the fridge stocked person and Lanny the ideologue?
That might be an easy characteristic of it, but that probably shortchanges Fran a bit. Because Fran chose to come to a political organization.
Mhm.
She could have been stocking fridges elsewhere.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
And Lanny, at least in his, as my reading of his, where he is now, looks back and says, you know, the political work wasn't as important as the community, you know, and as the sport, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he came to it with a political thing, and then, you know, realized around him that, you know, that the whole role that the drop-in center played, that the housing played, of meeting people's personal needs, was really valuable.
Yes.
It was really valuable, you know, and you know, he probably, you know, together with Barry or whoever, writing these funding proposals. That they weren't writing funding proposals for, you know, seeking funds for picket signs. You know, they're seeking funds for, you know, for running a place that people could go to and be comfortable and meet each other. So, you know, I mean, Lanny wasn't. I don't want to make anybody seem too unidimensional in all this.
Yeah.
But certainly in the time that I was there, Lanny was critical to the formation, you know, vision of what it was. If there was no Lanny, it would not have been an NPA. I mean, it's simple as that. I think, you know, Lanny was the seed.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think, and the other piece is the story that he tells about the inspiration behind the NPA was this support group, or this group he was going to at the Burnaby Mental Health Center, and then the suicides that happened on the weekends, and then them not being allowed to share phone numbers and connect. So right at the beginning, there was appreciation for the importance of supporting and community.
Yeah.
But then his politics would, you know, being on the left, yeah, would be the political piece. So, you know, Barry Cool was around during your time, and perhaps Stan Persky, though I don't know how.
Stan was not particularly active. I mean, it was something at the Lanny and Barry show.
Yeah. Yeah, and what did Barry do?
Barry was to a large degree the day-to-day running of the thing. I mean, I think he was much more kind of just out there in the drop-in center, just making sure phones got answered and greeting people when they came in the door. I mean, he was, he's a very sociable kind of guy. So you'd walk in, and kind of look around, and, might well be Barry would walk over to you and say, "Hi, my name's Barry. Who are you?" I say, "I think, have a Coke." Lanny may have been kind of, sitting in the corner, kind of, laying out the next copy of a nutshell or something. It's, I think Barry was really a lot of the administrative glue.
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like those guys had such good connections. Like I mean, I see, they just seem to be so well connected with. They had connections with the press. I think they had connections with the CBC because they got enough attention, and with the Toronto Sun. Yeah.
Sure. And then again, of course, if you were a freelancer for the CBC, or you're a story editor for the CBC, and chances are fairly good. You lived in Kitsilano. It's like, who were the CBC people? Not a lot of people, live in Coquitlam and work for CBC.
In those days.
In those days, but you kind of lived downtown, and you looked for stories, and ultimately people kind of turned up at Rohan's record store or whatever, and flipped through discs together. I feel like I'm lamenting the loss of the Woodstock generation here. Suggest that it was all the village, but we were still to some degree. We were watching the death of the '60s, but it wasn't dead yet, right? So we were, we were still building new institutions. People were.
And there was money to do it, and we didn't need a lot.
We didn't need a lot. You got by very little.
Yeah. Yeah.
When at Co-op Radio, we would take like 2 or 3 salaries and spread them on 5 people or something like that with a kickback system.
They even did that in alternate schools. Ideal schools started that way, with the teachers and the childcare workers, everybody pooling their salaries until the school board put an X on that.
Yeah. And you really probably weren't around for the MPA when you weren't around at the MPA when the funding restrictions made the election thing more problematic, and then when they unionized.
Yeah.
Were you involved in the farm at all?
I don't think so.
Why does this sound like? I mean, clearly not so involved that I can answer the question directly. Where was the farm?
The farm was up the valley, and I just had to because there's a historical section in there's a few publications, and these are like my precious. People have shared these with me, but this header on into the 80s I know has a historical section. How to start.
I think we might have that.
My head is kicking around somewhere. God, I think all the places I have to go through.
History. It has all the funding, which is great. They were connected to the MPA too. Okay, the MPA's farm operated in 2 locations for nearly 2 years, from August 71 to July 73.
That's the time we were around.
Yeah.
It wasn't, it was not the, it wasn't really, okay, the farm. So an owner of a farm at Masquee was at the MPA's first meeting, and this is me remembering, as a person who had been institutionalized and offered a farmhouse, to the MPA rent free if the members agreed to pay the taxes, and they called it the Foundation for the Understanding of Nervous and Neurotic Illnesses, the Funny Farm.
Mm.
But it was, and they did like macrame, and there was something other, there was some other stuff about expressive dance or something like that they did out there. But the farm was not, it wasn't successful. It was like a failed
Yeah.
utopian.
That's right. This doesn't sound totally new to me. It does sound familiar, but and maybe it was a blip while I was there, and maybe we kind of went out to the farm a few times. And I seem to remember farms in there, but then again, we had friends who had farms too, so it may have been.
The person who was involved in it was Stan Bailey, and I wanted to interview him, but he didn't want to be interviewed. And there was a woman's residence established in 1974.
We were out of the country then.
Oh,
Yeah.
Terry, how are you?
You're seeing all these names.
Well, that's what I'm doing. Is I'm looking down the list
But
here to see.
Evelyn has a thing in there.
Do you know
Evelyn
what?
really-
Do you know what
Yeah.
I don't?
Remember Jerry Walker? Yeah.
I don't have a copy. I have not located a copy of Portland Frank, which I wonder was the same as Kathy Frank, published a bibliography, an anti-psychiatry bibliography that I haven't looked at. But this is another, but this is a 1983 publication.
Interesting. So when exactly did NPA then become unionized? Because this was quite a shock to me. When I retired 3 years ago, and before that I was working as a child and youth mental health clinician with what is now Vancouver Coastal Health.
Yes,
Started off
yeah.
with Greater Vancouver Mental
Yeah.
Health Services. And we had a contract with NPA to run a youth-supported independent living program. They also ran the adult-supported independent living program. And all of a sudden, here I was, interfacing with an NPA that was very different from what I remembered NPA.
So your MP, you
the
had
current, more
so you
current.
kind of disconnected from the NPA in the
For
mid
years.
70s
Yes.
and reconnected in the
No, in the 2000s.
So
It was very strange because some of the language was, and I was around when it changed from the Mental Patients Association to Motivation, Power, Achievement.
So are you comfortable talking about how you found it and what was the same and what had changed?
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to say, but I can certainly say a few things. I mean, some of the language was still the same. I mean, they still refer to people as the members. And it was the members who changed, who wanted the name changed. And that, this is what I was told. I mean, I was not, here I was a liaison, and the inside person from MPA who I talked to, who was one of their supervisors, told me was the members no longer felt comfortable having it called the Mental Patients Association. But in order to keep it as MPA, they then changed it to Motivation, Power, and Achievement. So I think not only, so it's sort of the organization that's changed, but also the people they represent has changed. That when we went, when it wasn't my job to do housing, although I was involved in the housing program, I contracted with them to go out and look for housing for these young people. And they would never tell people that this was the Mental Patients Association, even when it was still the Mental Patients. It was MPA Society, is how they would refer to it, in trying to sell a landlord into renting to a young person who had some sort of mental psychiatric issue. No, that was just interesting.
Yeah, and what about other aspects of it?
Well, it's a unionized job. That was another whole other change, right? I mean, there was no more democratic way of hiring. The hiring happened, a supervisor and manager hired an individual, they didn't hire an individual. But that's not just a change with MPA. When I think about it, when I first started working, my first social work job the whole team would interview people. This is how, this was with, in those days I was with the Vancouver Resources Board, and I know GVMHS functioned the same way too, that in the 70s, we, even in the established organizations, we didn't have just the personnel department or, you know, our personnel practices were different. The whole team had to say, this was the right person for us. Whether you were hiring a coordinator supervisor for your team or whether you were hiring a fellow staff. So it changed at MPA, but it also it changed in a parallel way, maybe not quite as dramatic, in straight organizations too.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, well, that's a fascinating description of how the name changed.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
But no, it didn't. You know, other than people still being called members, and I think they would have some meetings, and the drop-in. I think the drop-in was still. That's something that's been maintained.
Oh yes,
They do have a drop-in.
Willie filmed
And-
there a couple of,
Yeah.
no, one afternoon.
Yeah.
One afternoon. Yeah. I'm
So I
sorry.
think that's still something solid.
But it's
It's
a
not the
drop
same.
in that doesn't feel like the place that you describe. You know,
No.
just because of the kind of people that are there.
Yeah.
But it's on 4th, just
Yeah.
just east of Burrard, on
Right.
4th, and
Yeah.
yeah, and you have to be 19.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Our kids couldn't go in until they turned 19. The program that I connected with
Right.
recently
Oh, okay.
was a program for 16 to 21-year-olds, and not until they reached 19 could they be involved. And it's much more of much more of a service organization, right?
Mhm,
The
mhm.
staff visit the homes. I was involved with the SIL program, where people lived in their independent homes, but there was a staff person who would come once a week or so just to check in on things.
Yeah, yeah.
So it,
And are the homes still run
cooperative. I didn't get involved in the
Yeah,
whole
I
thing
just-
this way, so
yeah.
I don't know. I get the feeling that it's not like it used to be, but it's not like there's staff living there.
Yeah. Do you remember, because you filmed that interview on
Yeah.
Friday with Jill, the staff
Mhm.
person? Did she talk about how the homes are?
Not really.
Yeah.
No. She didn't.
But she did talk about how things had changed. And I mean, it was a phenomenally successful organization, right? And
Mhm.
success creates its own dynamic, I
Yeah.
guess, you know?
And not just this, what was happening in the world
Yeah.
outside, the funding changes.
Yeah. Yeah.
They were much more they're dependent on Vancouver Coastal Health for funding, right? And I expect they even experienced the changes when the mental health organization was taken over by Vancouver Coastal Health.
Mhm.
It was,
Mhm.
there were changes when it was GVMHS, I'm sure, it was still a, establishment organization, but even more so when it became part of Vancouver Coastal Health, and they now have to, they have to, make sure that they prove themselves each time that they get refunded, right?
Yeah.
They have certain they're accountable
Yeah. Yeah.
in ways that didn't happen in those days. That's why they don't have any paperwork for you to look at, right? Now you have to have that. Right?
Yeah, yeah. No, it amazes me that there
Deliverables.
must have been minutes taken of all those meetings. Maybe not.
Well, there probably were. Minutes probably were taken. Lanny and Barry were too organized not to have done that. However, whether or not the minutes survive is another issue.
Yeah,
Mm.
the organization doesn't
Yeah.
have them. But
We
anyway,
belong to other organizations like that too. We're the Minutes for Shalom from the early days.
Yeah.
They're gone. And, if we had had computers, we probably could retrieve it, right?
yeah, yeah. So is there anything else coming up looking through that? Lenny's sister was really involved, huh? She did a lot of artwork.
Bonnie, yeah.
Bonnie.
For Bonnie, she was always kind of viewed as being Lenny's sister. Yeah, I remember when she first opened her Beck Person's store on Commercial Drive. I don't think it's anywhere near as creative stuff as she had originally. It was a real interesting hodgepodge.
She also revived the mattress?
Advanced Mattress Coffee House.
Right.
The new Advanced Mattress Coffee House. Yeah. And this even predates us, but in the 1930s or 40s, there had been an advanced mattress company in Vancouver. They made mattresses. Advanced was the name. And then they went out of business. And then at some point, some folks in, I guess, around 1966 or so, took over the space and made a coffee house out of it during the era of coffee houses. So this was the Advanced Mattress Coffee House. Simply using the old Advanced Mattress name above the door. And it was, I guess, a kind of a hangout place for kind of musicians and hippies and all that through, I don't know, 66, 67, 68. And then times changed, and it folded. And then Bonnie started to revise that, so she opened up in yet another location, because that location was not gone, the new Advanced Mattress Coffee House. But it didn't click as being kind of the place where all the up and coming musicians would just kind of hang out and drink coffee and play for free. We had it in the 60s. But yeah, she was trying to bring art and community organizing together.
Yeah, yeah. She was very very helpful in helping me connect with Lanny.
Yeah.
Very nice about that, actually,
Mm-hmm.
because she was being generous to me, but also respectful of her brother, which I thought was really nice. Yeah. Is there anything we haven't talked about? You guys have been great.
Things will occur to me perhaps after you've gone, but I was actually nervous about you coming because I think to myself, I don't remember enough. I still, so much of it is vanished. I mean, just to go down to the MPA and start seeing these names again. Right, Jerry Walker. Terry Hoy. But I don't know that I have stories or issues.
No, I think that you've, particularly actually of the drop-in, those pieces were really, really interesting, and also the very early housing before they owned houses
Mm-hmm.
is interesting. And I'm just so amazed by them buying those houses and starting the Phoenix, the apartment building, and all that.
Even on the rental housing, I mean, there were issues. I mean, you get a house, but there's no furniture, right? So we needed to come up with the money, or however to, we need some couches, we need some beds, we need this, we need that. So I mean, there was a certain resourcefulness necessary to do that. And there's also the need to be able to reassure the landlords that, if anything was wrong, we as an organization are backing these people up. We will do restitution if, if a wall gets damaged or something like that, which it did from time to time. People would just pound their fist into the wall in some way, I'm not sure we had the money for that, but we needed money, even for rentals. We needed money for equipment and liability.
And they still do that. In the program that I was involved in, the Youth Silk program, they would still back each and every one of them. Those were kids, right? And yes, sometimes those places got pretty dirty and there were holes punched and stuff, but they would back them up.
Yeah. And where did you get the furniture from then?
That's what I'm wondering. I mean, as I'm saying this, where did I guess some of it we simply bought at Sallingham. Or we kind of, I don't know, just kind of put the word out that we were looking for it. Ask people who I work with at Crisis Center if they happen to have, a lamp or desks or whatever, if they hear of any, you'd let me know. You just scrounged.
Yeah, and we did that for ourselves too.
That's right.
There's no difference.
People moved out. The people were winding up a co-op house on 4th Avenue and moving into the interiors. They'd say, "Well, can we get your fridge? Before that other co-op gets your fridge." So,
Yeah, and if you had and some people were Vancouverites and their parents had stuff, and we just
And probably people needed clothing too, huh?
yeah.
yeah. I hate shopping for myself, so I never volunteered to be the clothing coordinator for darn sure.
Probably need a friend for that.
Probably a friend would. I think friends go
But
with
people,
shopping.
but you do for others. The members themselves did a lot of it. I mean, I have this memory. I don't remember who this person was, but he was a member of MPA who regularly would go to Safeway and to the other stores and get the stuff that had either just expired or was about to expire. And the store owners, like the Safeway store owner, would know him and he would always get those. We learned about looking at the dates from him.
That's right.
I mean, I learned how to bargain for some things.
Totally brilliant guy.
And
narrow little, very soft spoken.
yeah, I don't remember his name.
But he was right. I mean, he knew that the best before date was Thursday, and Safeway was closing at 6 o'clock. He'd get in there at 5:45 to say, "Don't just throw that out, give it to me."
And he would bring stuff to MPA.
And he was constantly bringing fresh fruit and food to MPA, stuff which had just passed its best by date by one day, right? And he was constantly organizing this stuff. And this was his particular obsession. He said, "There's a lot of stuff out there in society that's being wasted."
So this is, I mean, it's so like in the current thing, right? But this is just an individual's initiative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A member who had that survival skill. And
He had that survival skill, and because this society throws out and wastes far more than any one person can consume, he was constantly able to supply the house. I know, some people would look at it and say, "These bananas are gone brown." He'd say, "They didn't cost anything, so what do you expect?" So not everyone appreciated what he was doing, but
But he got the yogurt that had tomorrow's date on it, or even today's date, and that's fine.
yeah.
Yeah, yogurt lasts way past the
Yeah,
sell, I think.
and bananas too, and we started doing that. Yeah.
What's his name? The sweetest guy. Traveled with the bicycle all the time. Load things on his carrying case on his bike.
So there were, I mean, him I remember, but I'm sure there were others like him.
Well,
Dave
Dave Beamisher, I don't know if you remember Dave, but he talked about, and really movingly, I felt, about what the MPA did for people's self-esteem, because it gave them a place, where they would be accepted, where they could grow, they could develop their talent, they could contribute. Right?
And didn't he work for MPA in more recent years? Yeah, that's, I mean, I know
Or
his
for
name.
yes, he's,
I know him from more recent years.
yeah, but he was also involved with, I think, with the Mental Health Association,
Is it
do you remember
CMHA?
Willie, what he was
He was talking about
CMHA?
being on review panels.
Oh, and on review, oh yes,
Oh,
the Riverview
but didn't he
Review.
work for MPA
Yes,
more
I think
recently?
so. Oh,
Was he
perhaps.
director or something?
No.
No?
No.
Or was something?
No, but he was on the, like he'd been on, probably a patient rep on a lot of
Oh, maybe
things.
that's it, but
Yeah.
his
Yeah.
name is more recent to me
Mhm,
than
mhm.
I hear.
Yeah, no, he just said that was, for him, he didn't share the plan, he's left politics, but he felt comfortable there, and, I mean, one of the sort of buzzwords around mental health, as you guys know, is all about stigma and discrimination, and, how well do you think that the MPA, in the period where you guys were really engaged with it, how well do you think it worked against stigma and
I
discrimination?
think for some people, it then became possible to say, "Yes, I am." You know, some people were kind of able to come out of the closet and say, oh, okay, I can say I had mental I've had hospitalizations and all that, and not be ashamed. You know, and as we've seen with, you know, abuse victims, you know, who ultimately come to us will say, yeah, somebody diddled me when I was in the coast, and I did DACA for years. So, you know, did it have a lingering vast change in our society? I don't know. I mean, in general, our society is becoming more accepting of diversity, or I still think so. You know, federal government, which is kind of suppressing that. I think this is just part of that, of the times that, you know, you could say, yeah, this is who I am, this is where I come from, and I don't need to apologize for it. Some people, like it says, you know, the Mental Patient Association membership wanted to change its name to Movement, Power, and Acupuncture, or whatever it was. So clearly it hadn't shaken it completely. But I think for some people who went through there, you're able to say, oh yeah, all right, I can now say, you know, I'm a recovering alcoholic. I mean, that's, you know, that's one of the things for people on 5-step programs or 7-step programs or 13 steps or anything steps it takes. Is to say, you know, hi, my name is Avi and I talk too much, right? Once you can kind of own it, you know, you can, well, you know.
Yeah, I think it probably did it for the individuals who were involved. I'm sorry to say that I don't think it's done it on a larger societal level. That stigma's still a very, very big issue out there.
Well, and as you pointed out, that's why the members
change
wanted
of
to change
name.
the name.
And, you know, we see that all the time.
Another way in which it may have operated on an individual level was that people like Patty, as I understand her story, came out to BC after being in Ponoka and in Alberta and started volunteering, and then she got a job at the MPA. So in an era, well, it's probably still the case, but where it was difficult for people who'd been in an institution to get employment, MPA was employment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, given that there was, I mean, like I said, there's this tension between, do you hire people who are ex-patients, or do you hire people that, you know, you figure you're going to do the job well? And it's just really tension. There wasn't a clear policy either way. But given the preference, if possible, to hire ex-patients where you can, that there are probably a number of people like that who got a preferential start in the, being trusted in the work world.
Yeah.
And the other thing, and I don't know whether it was MPA or the same, the same things that created MPA helped create or reinforce the consumer movement. Because I think that, you know, we certainly do know that that's come out of that same period of time, and it still exists.
Yeah, I think that's an important reflection as well. Yes, yeah, which the consumer group movement may be more or less critical of psychiatry or power structures, but it nonetheless is a voice of people who have previously didn't have a voice.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Where, I guess, reflecting just on being older now, and also having worked in child and youth mental health, the area that I don't know whether MPA could have had anything to do with, and I think it couldn't, is the whole family, like where do families fit into, or where do families support the individual, and MPA never got involved in that. You know, what was the role of those same, you know, the members' parents, brothers, sisters, etc.
Yeah, so
And I
you
know
don't
that's
remember
an
any
issue
contact
now.
with family then?
We wouldn't force it.
Yeah.
But I don't remember having any. Did MPA have a position vis-a-vis family? I don't remember that. It's like the consumer movement now. Sometimes works in conflict, right, with families.
Yeah.
And I
Molly
don't.
came with Fred. Bonnie
No,
turned
but
up because of Lenny. I mean, if you had good relations with your family, then they shared your world, and if you had distant relationships with them, there wasn't the kind of an ethic which says, you must go and build bridges.
No, I'm not even, I think there were, it was just not part of the philosophy, and I'm not thinking about Molly with Fred, as that's her kid. I'm thinking more of, if somebody was having a psychotic break, what did MPA do in terms of connecting with family or not connecting with family? And I don't remember that at all.
The degree to which we knew who their family was, we might have been in touch with them.
I just don't remember.
Yeah, I mean, as the community mental health centers evolved, and the one in Kits did work with the MPA, they might have been the link to family.
They've never been.
But I think your point is well taken, that it wasn't as though family was shut out of this.
Mhm.
In that Bonnie was, there might well have been other illustrations. Bonnie was
Mhm.
very involved
Mhm.
in a nutshell, in terms of supplying cartoons and
Mhm.
illustrations for different publications, and you know, as someone who had not been a patient but was
Right.
obviously connected to a brother.
And I wonder how many of the, and I just don't know, how many of the people involved in MPA were originally from this area?
Mm.
I mean, how many of them were raised in Burnaby and West,
Yeah,
Richmond?
well, for sure, we will never know that.
You know,
But that would be interesting.
It would be
Because-
fascinating.
because the West Coast at the time, of course, was the magnet for all, all of us folks who kind of drifted in and off the prairies, and draft dodgers came up from the States and all that kind of thing. I mean, our world, it's interesting to look back in sometime in the 1980s and 90s, realize that almost all the people we were friendly with, a huge number of them, all turned up in Vancouver in 1971. Like a staggering number of, the class of 71, Why didn't we know people from 1969? Why did we not know anybody from 1975, right? People of even different ages all kind of came in 71. That's who we tended to know. And I wonder whether, in fact, the question of family, how many people at MPA as consumers had family living nearby? I mean, if you've been in Crease Clinic, Riverview, then quite possibly you were from Richmond or Burnaby and Vancouver.
Mhm.
But you may have come down Kelowna. You may have had a psychotic break after you moved in to Saskatoon, and therefore family was way back there. I just don't know.
And we have only interviewed, I think, or at least I have only interviewed, I think, two people who had been patients.
Really?
Well, they're really hard to find.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Patty. And she came from Alberta.
Yeah.
But Lanny's from Vancouver, and Dave Beamish had been in the army and had ended up in Vancouver. A mixture then, I guess.
Mhm.
Of people who maybe had come as migrants and then had some kind of difficulty and
Mhm.
ended up within the mental health system.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. But Vancouver, in particular, Kits was a very
Yeah.
transient community. People have said that.
But I know there's a tension now, so I wondered whether that tension was reflected in those days too, between the consumer groups and the family groups.
Oh yes.
So
Yes.
that's my curiosity.
Yeah. No, we've kind of run a little bit of, and we've had to deal with some of the politics of that. We've just with us, yeah. But I'm not putting that on tape.
I'm
yeah.
just thinking like Susan Inman is a representative. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, and it's
And
very
it's-
deeply traumatic for families, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, is there done? Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Alright.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Do
yeah,
me
Susan
one
Inman.
favor and then, bleep up my reference to
she
Betty
said-
Betty
she said-
Tarrant as a witch.
But we need
okay?
the Susan Inman.
Yeah, we do. Yeah.
And I think, the